afternoon, everybody. The title of the presentation is actually quite accurate as far as the UK is concerned, because it was exactly 40 years ago last year that this country had its first energy auditing program set up, way back in the 1970s after the first oil crisis. So that's not one of those headings which is rough and ready. It is exactly correct. So what I want to do today, just very quickly, first is just to give you the usual health warnings that everybody has in their presentations. What I'm going to cover today is industrial energy efficiency audits. That is going to be reasonably broadly set in a policy context. By industry, I think this is the IPCC definition of industry, in the sense that it's non-domestic sectors, not households, and not transport. The whole presentation is meant as a guide. It's meant to signpost you to other information as far as I can. I think there'll be some publications posted somewhere on the site that you can look at afterwards, where there will be detailed bibliographies that you can dig down into the detail. I've cited a couple of papers in the presentation that you can pick up directly. It's not a blueprint, and it's certainly not an instruction manual. Audits and energy efficiency programs differ according to the country you're in and the government that you are part of, or the business that you work for, so I can't be specific. One of the advantages of my position, being part business, part academic, and having worked in government many years ago, is that most of what I'm going to tell you today is backed up by the literature. It's established fact, it's published. Some of it towards the end of the presentation is actually quite new, but it's certainly backed up by evidence. And a little bit in the middle of the presentation is based on my own personal experience way back in 2004, when I was helping to set up the Carbon Trust here in the UK. And finally, my thanks to the ECEEE and Niels Bohr and Energy Funding for the research funding that has delivered this presentation to you today. Okay, what I want to cover quickly, the introduction, which is where we are now, a little bit on policy context of audits and industrial energy efficiency more generally. I look back in time, as I say, over the last 40 years, a little bit of definition on the sort of textbook definition of what an audit is and what it is for. Some personal reflections and some reflections from the evidence out there about what an audit program does, how it works, what sort of things you need to worry about if you are in the process of thinking about setting one up. Towards the end, the impact of audit programs, and basically what makes a good one. What sort of success factors are we seeing in the literature for audit programs that have clearly delivered what they set out to deliver? And then finally, I want to have a brief look right at the end of where audits and where energy efficiency programs might be going in the future. Okay, policy context. Now, don't worry too much about the detail in this slide. What this is a picture of is the UK's emissions in all sectors expressed as million tons of CO2 equivalent on the left-hand axis, and the first bar of the chart is 1990, when our base year is set. And the second bar is the progress we've made to 2013, so last year. And as you can see, there's been roughly a 25% cut in emissions of all CO2. The bar on the right-hand side is the UK government's target, which is an 80% reduction in 2050. And as you can see, significant progress, but there's quite a lot to do, and there's a piece of this chart missing in between 2013 and 2050, which the government is right now working out how to deliver. And if we move on to the next slide, this is quite complex. Don't worry too much about the detail. If you look at the government's targets for around about 2015, what we call our fourth carbon budget, we're missing around about 85 million tons of CO2, which at the moment is not accounted for in the plans of the government's policies. And of that, the government is fairly confident that roughly a third is covered by the policies they have in mind, but probably two-thirds, the orange bar and the grey bar, is areas where there's a considerable risk that delivery is not currently organised. Now, this is not meant to be a criticism of the government of the UK. I don't think this is rare. I think everybody has this problem, and I think this is really the starting point for the presentation. Most developed countries are struggling to deliver the reductions that they set out with back in '97 when the Kyoto Protocol was drafted. And I think the reason for that is basically that we've moved beyond low-lying fruit, as it's called in literature, which means the easy energy efficiency gains, the easy renewables deployment. Scale development of renewables is proving to be very costly or politically very sensitive, and of course austerity and the credit crunch has scaled down subsidy programs in all countries. And so governments, ours included, are reviewing their programs to try and work out how to improve their impact. I think, as ever, transport and domestic sectors are proving very, very intransigent. So, I mean, basically, industry programs are back on the agenda, and I think this is something which is, as you'll see in a second, is how it all started. Industrial audits, which was the purpose of this presentation, in the past, easily the most commonly cited program, if you look through the literature, of the 300 or so papers that the ECEEE has in its archives, over 70 are specifically on audits, which is way more than the next one in the list, which is taxation. Most Western countries have audit programs in some form. Some don't call them that, but they are there. And some, like the UK, have had them for a long time, 40 years now in the UK's instance. They're popular also because we know how they work. Audits are quite easily understood. They're quite simple in their underpinnings, and therefore they're relatively uncontroversial as programs go. As a result, they make sense to governments in most countries. They're relatively easy to set up. They're relatively apolitical in the way that they address energy efficiency in markets. And of course, in the EU, audits are now mandatory as part of the Energy Efficiency Directive for larger organisations. So audits are very much going up the agenda, certainly in Europe. So that's where we are now. Let's go back in time a little bit, and this chart will be familiar to many of you. If not, I'll just talk you through it briefly. And again, please don't worry about the detail, but what this is showing is the oil price over the last, where am I, 1861, 150 years or so. This is basically the reason why energy efficiency programs started as back in 1972, 1973. And I would focus on the dark green line. The light green line is the 2013 oil prices. The dark green line is the oil prices as they were then in 1970s. And I think that's a much more stark demonstration of the shock that the world felt when oil jumped from $2 a barrel to over $12 a barrel in less than 6 months. Especially since oil prices, as you can see, have been bumping along in $2, $3, $4 a barrel for nearly 100 years. And suddenly they were 3 or 4 times that. I know in recent years oil prices jumped, but if you imagine oil jumping from around about 80, as it is now, up to something like $800 a barrel, and we'd be panicking quite hard. And that's what it was like in the 70s. And those of us older than 40, 50 or so can remember what it was like. So the early programs in the UK, which of course is my experience, so if I've got any of this wrong, I do apologize, started at around that time in 1974. My feeling is the US was first, but I could be wrong. And then the UK joined very shortly after, followed by the Scandinavian countries, Finland and Japan. The early programs, the early audit programs, basically focused on technologies. The massive jump in the price of oil meant that the government felt that the thing to do was to replace furnaces and motors and drives and what have you, with new versions which saved energy. So all of the early programs that we ran in those days were basically focused on equipment and plant. So we had grants, we had reviews of the opportunity that you could get if you changed equipment, we had best practice programs, and of course research and demonstration programs and roadshows and all sorts of programs like that. And they were quite significant programs. The first one I mentioned was around about £400 million over 3 years, which would be significant now, but nothing compared to the one that was launched 3 years afterwards, which was nearly £3 billion. That's 4.5 billion euros, which is roughly the same order of magnitude as is spent at the moment on all low-carbon technologies in the UK. So significant programs. After that period, what was interesting was that towards the start of the 1980s and into the late 1990s, audits changed in their focus. They changed from being technology-based programs into programs focusing on the organization that they were being operated within. So instead of technologies, they looked at the whole company's energy performance. And as such, they moved away from looking at just technologies to looking at organizational drivers as well. And I'll come on to what I mean by that in a moment for those of you who don't know. This is where I got involved in the process back in 1989 or thereabouts. And there was this famous 5-step process. And you can see an example of one of the magazines that we published back then there, which was looking at how to manage energy inside large organizations. And of course, shortly after that, the whole profession of energy management began to take shape. You began to see the formation of the energy management professional bodies that we have in the UK and in the US as well. So towards the mid-90s and well out until the late 90s, energy management used audits to generate change management programs across companies. Now, the third phase of the evolution of the audit, or the evolution of the programs of which audits are a part by now, was the rise of climate change in 1988-89, when the first IPCC reports were being drafted, where there was a political consensus that something needed to be done around climate change. And at the same time, and in response to that, consumers began to demand green products and green services. You found companies responding in a number of ways. The one that I remember again was in around about 94. You saw the development of this concept of the triple bottom line, where companies could take action to save money, to save energy, and also to boost their sales. Later on in 2002, 2003, you began to see the emergence of a slightly different focus on energy management, which was called carbon management by the Carbon Trust. I still think the Carbon Trust were probably first to that, but again, I could be wrong. This triggered a number of what I think are best called voluntary disclosure projects, of which the most famous is the Carbon Disclosure Project, where companies measure their carbon and benchmark themselves against each other. Over here we had some very important company-based ones too, such as the Marks and Spencer's Plan A, which was a little broader than carbon, but still a disclosure-based project. And more recently, we're seeing the emergence of mandatory carbon reporting in annual reports and shareholder reports. This, in a sense, it came full circle in 2014, this year, where we're now seeing this whole concept of carbon bubbles take shape, where companies are being viewed against the risk that they hold in fossil fuel shares or fossil fuel stakes, that these resources will get stranded as climate change begins to take effect, and the people demand that they move their money out of that sort of investment. So energy audits themselves have been around for a long time, but the context in which they operate is changing quite sharply. Now, just moving on quickly, I just want to spend a little bit of time on, if you like, the current consensus on what an audit is for and what it looks like. If you look at the literature and you look at textbooks mainly, you'll see that audits are basically described in this way, that they are change management programs for energy. We have an energy efficiency gap where the amount of energy that could be saved is less than is technically possible. This is less prevalent where energy is a significant proportion of turnover, but it is most evident in smaller, less energy-intensive companies where energy is not core business and is not actively managed. And the whole concept of an audit is basically that they are there to help manage that process and influence the drivers and barriers driving energy efficiency. So a very quick chart, which I think will be familiar to both of you. So I'm going to just leave it on for a short period of time, looking at the barriers and the drivers that you find in typical companies. Now, if you look at a modern audit program, you see that it is structured, well, on the one hand, to overcome barriers, but also to exploit drivers more typically. So you see senior management or board level commitment to reduce energy, an organization-wide review of energy use, benchmarking of the company's performance against similar companies in the same sector so they can see what their competitors are doing and how much they are saving compared to them, a list of practical, cost-effective, recommended measures and technologies, and an organizational wrapper, if you like, on implementation, monitoring and review. So that's a typical audit. As I mentioned before, I was lucky to be involved when the Carbon Trust was set up in 2001, and it it's basically had the job of setting up a brand new set of audit programs for the business community in the UK and the public sector. I'll just point you to the reference at the bottom of this page. These are personal reflections and my memory, which is probably faulty, but it's also drawn from this wonderful book by Patrick Tholander and Jenny Palm, which I've cited there, which I strongly recommend you go and get if you are serious about setting up audits. It is a very, very detailed exposition on how this all works. So what do they look like? Well, they basically have 5 or 6 features. There is obviously a policy driver, a policy objective that rests with government. There is a library of information, market data, so that the government can understand what it's trying to do. Some sort of delivery agency or program manager or some sort of entity that manages this for them. Within that structure, there is obviously an auditing function, auditors or advisors or consultants. If the government feels it necessary, and it's not essential, but it's quite common, there'll be some sort of program of support for the organizations, or subsidy, or some sort of incentive to drive change. And then finally, something which is forgotten, or it used to be forgotten quite a lot, was you need to manage the relationship with the organization and the sector. So you need some sort of account management facility and some sort of customer relationship management process. So that, if you like, is the nuts and bolts of an auditing program. What sort of things should you worry about? I think some of the things that you see coming out of the literature, pardon me, are it's critical to understand what you're trying to do. It's so common that you find audit programs fail because the government doesn't understand the barriers or the risks and drivers of the business, or what sort of technology that they can access, how they spend their money, how their business plan operates, and how they view compliance. It's very, very common to see programs failing because of that sort of lack of understanding. Something the Carbon Trust did early on, which surprised me because I was a civil servant, I'd never heard of it, was it segmented its market on the basis that you can't give the same level of subsidy to a micro business and an aluminium smelting plant. I mean, the prize for the smelting plant is so much bigger than, as my ex-director once said it, the place on the corner where everybody buys their newspapers on the way to work. So programs have to try and account for that, and it's something governments find really hard, but you have to segment the market, so you offer different levels of support to different types of organization. Something that needs to be decided early on is how much subsidy you offer, or if any, as part of the change management and the auditing process. I'll come on to this a little bit more later on, so I'll leave that for now. Sorting out data. Do we know how the market is organized? Do we know how many shops there are? Do we know how many aluminium smelting works there are? Where are they? What size are they? These things are actually quite difficult to get your hands on, because obviously they're commercially sensitive. So obviously if other people have that information, like energy utilities, you need to see if you can get hold of that. It may be protected. These things all need planning very early on, as does any intellectual property you might need. And then finally, the thing that I think also lets down a lot of programs is how are we going to decide that they've worked? And this doesn't have to be carbon. It can be other metrics such as market transformation, but this needs to be agreed up front, because if you don't, then you get very confused when you decide that you want the program to deliver. And people have to have their expectations managed, and you can't do that retrospectively. So those are some reflections on what you might want to think about before you set a program up. As you are going through the process, again, I will refer you to Patrick Solander and Jenny's book on this, but I mean, basically, my recollection of what we had to go through when I did this was that actually appointing a delivery agent is really, well, it can be quite easy, but if you've got a poorly developed consultancy sector, you are going to have to develop the skills they need to deliver it on your behalf. So you have to decide whether you have those skills in-house or whether you have to procure them, and whether you have to go overseas or not. I've mentioned KPIs. Auditor networks, again, if you don't have one, you have to build one. They are not straightforward. You have to liaise with the professional bodies and understand exactly how much of this you can call on. And of course, if they're doing something else, you have to persuade them to work for you. So it can be an extremely resource-intensive job. Account management I've mentioned, and program collateral is an interesting one that the UK is currently thinking about. Change management programs involve advice and information delivered by the consultants and the auditors. You may have to develop this. It may not exist. The library of information that we developed for the UK back in the 80s and 90s has largely gone now. And until quite recently, I got quite agitated about this because, of course, the physics of motors and drives and furnaces doesn't change. So if we'd lost that, we would have to buy it all again. But I'm less convinced it's as important as it was, because, of course, companies can find out their own information. But it's something to think about ahead of time. Okay. So moving back onto the literature and audits themselves. Do they work? This is a less certain area of the literature. It's certainly not uncertain, but it's not as clear as the structure of audits and their rationale. So I would imagine probably there's about a dozen significant papers on this, and that's what this is drawn from. Do they work? Well, yes. They are popular for a reason. They are relatively straightforward to understand and to implement. Pardon me. However, if you look at the reviews of impact that you can trust, most of them are implementing less than 50% of the measures that the auditors recommend. So of all the cost-effective things that an organization can do to improve its energy use, less than half are implemented. And it's generally a lot lower than that. I remember in the Carbon Trust, we inherited implementation rates in the low 30s, and we got them up to the mid-40s, and it got stuck again. They would not go above the mid-40s, 48. It could have changed now, and if somebody on the line from the Carbon Trust, maybe they can tell us, but certainly around about 50% seems to be a brick wall. And some programs, of course, can be very low in their impact, low as 15, 20% in some cases. The reason why I wouldn't say there's a consensus out there, I mean, I've picked up sort of two areas where I think academics are beginning to coalesce. One is that there's clearly, we don't quite understand the wide variations in the way companies take up measures. And the one that is clear is, of course, technology versus behavioral change. Technology change lasts a lot longer, has a larger persistence period, whereas behavioral change can disappear in 2 or 3 months when people lose interest or the person who drove it has left. There's also a clear change in many audit programs between subsidized audits and ones that are cost shared. Larger companies tend to operate better when they have to pay a contribution, but smaller companies don't. And you also see wide variations between different types of organizations, and that won't be a surprise to you, but anyway, it's worth mentioning that you see differences between public and private. You see differences between large and small. You also see differences in the drivers and barriers. So companies who have reputational drivers differ in their response to audits and industrial programs like this. Again, I'll come on to that in a second. So why don't they work? Why do we see this uncertainty? Well, I think the answer is we don't definitively know, because we're only starting to look hard at audit programs in a systematic way. But here are some pointers that I picked out of the literature. One is, I think, pretty fundamental, is that barriers and drivers are interconnected. Companies don't operate in isolation. The one that I see most often is that finance is rarely the only barrier to change. It's no good giving a small company money when they haven't got the senior management time to spend it. Reputational drivers underexploited. I remember a long time ago I went on a tour of the northeastern states of the US, and the companies, we were told that it was companies who faced the public who would be most susceptible to reputational drivers. And of course the instant interpretation of that is retail, the Sainsbury's and the Marks and Spencers in this country. But the companies we found most responsive in the US, and this was at the time of the first Iraq war, were the defense contractors. They had no other way to show how cuddly they were, other than to save carbon in their processes. You find this also in pharmaceuticals that have a big reputational issue, and also in financial services as well. Reputational drivers are poorly understood. Skills and experiences are generally hard to find in audit programs that aren't working well, and that's both within the organization that you're trying to change, but also in the auditor network as well, as I've mentioned. And then finally, and this is an interesting one for government, I think they've ever got their heads around this properly, is that companies rarely ask for what they actually need in terms of support. And I think distinguishing between what somebody wants and what they need is really quite hard. The classic example is grants versus loans. If you give somebody a grant, it's gone. They can spend it and then not do anything. But if you give them a loan, you get it back. And you can link the loan to the energy saving in some sort of recycling fund, and the actual cost of the public purse is much lower. And also, if you ask a company what they want, they'll ask for a subsidy, but that might be the last thing they need. Pardon me. Okay, I'm aware that we've hit half an hour, so I'm going to overrun, but I think I've got 40 minutes, so I'm fine with that. So let's just take stock. What, from all of this, is the literature telling us about what makes a good audit program? Well, let's just list those areas. I think flexibility. It's, even if you understand your market, you obviously are setting out to change the market, so you need a program which responds to that change, and also that is able to be responsible and also resilient to changes in political circumstances. You need strong market intelligence. I can't overestimate this. You need it you need to understand the sector, you need to understand how individual organizations work, and you even have to understand how individuals within those organizations work, because they are the people at the end of the day who make the decisions. You need to look at this interconnectedness between drivers and barriers and exploit them. So investor pressure, for example, influencing the people who invest in the large pension funds, for example. They actually own the companies. They have significant influence in how that company operates. They can fire and hire the chief executive. Programs which are aimed at them are very effective because, of course, they get down and influence the senior management and the board. Successful audit programs tend to make the most of local networks. Companies are social animals, just like we are, and they work better when they're talking to people who've done the things you're trying to get them to do themselves. I've mentioned a credible auditor network. I think it stands to reason. You find that some degree of compulsion is important. I'm not saying that it is always important. I think you have to be careful. But you find that some of the most effective programs have started off as voluntary, but had the threat of compulsion somewhere in the system. And you find that is very influential in driving companies to change. And I've mentioned cost sharing already, so I'll skip over that. Okay, there's about 5 or 6 minutes to go. Now, so where are we? I think we know that audits, obviously started off as technology standalone programs that were actually essentially there to help civil servants manage the panic that we saw in the 1970s to save energy. So they were there as supports. The rise of the whole agenda of climate change has changed their role from measuring energy use to a more risk and value orientated role. Audits themselves haven't changed very much, but their role has. I think now they're much more at the center of what a company sees as its risk management strategy. In government terms, you tend to find them now less as standalone audit programs and more as part of relatively sophisticated policies. The one that's most common in the literature is long-term agreements, or voluntary agreements as they're called in the UK. But the interesting thing, and I think this is where the literature is beginning to enter the realms of speculation, but I think it's interesting and well-informed speculation, is why do we still see only 50% of the measures that are being recommended being implemented? What's going on there? What are we doing wrong? And I think, the next slide is nearly the last slide. I just wanted to just take you through a few ideas. Now, I know Hans is on the line because I saw him sign in, so here's a plug for his paper. He and Charlotte Rubam have got this idea, which I don't think they call this, but it's certainly what I picked out of the paper, of energy efficiency framing. Audits are obviously all about identifying energy efficiency measures, and we're actually getting quite sophisticated at it because we've been doing it for a long time, but we're stuck against this 50% implementation barrier. Now, the idea that Hans and others have floated is that we need to think about this in a very different way, and perhaps one approach is to think about the burden of change. We are expecting organizations, mainly businesses, who've got other things to worry about, like making money, employing people and getting products out of the door, to take on faith that if they do a whole pile of things, it will save some energy. Now, is that fair? I'm not sure. But what about looking at it in a different way? Should we not be encouraging the technology supply side, the companies building an energy efficiency plant and equipment, or delivering the software and services that help them implement them? Should they be a little bit more effective, do we think, in improving what we call the offer, the energy efficiency offer, or in framing energy efficiency in a more sellable way? And I was talking to an official in my government department, DEC, in the UK about this yesterday, and he said that's very interesting because there are early signs that this is beginning to happen. And I think I mentioned a little while ago that you find people of my age worrying about the best practice programs of the past and where all that has gone and how are we going to advise companies of what the best technology is to use. Well, he said, well, it doesn't matter because, companies are getting very smart and they're crowdsourcing and setting up networks like the 2° network we have in the UK to find this out for themselves. And I did a little research on this overnight, and he's right. There is a lot going on out there where organizations are beginning to place pressure on their suppliers to improve the services they get on energy efficiency, so that when the audits come in, they are much easier to procure. And I think that's where I'll leave you. I think that's an interesting nugget of advice coming out of the literature that I think is worth watching in the future, so that perhaps the next 40 years we won't have the problems we're facing now. And with that, thank you very much for listening, and I hope we have some good questions.